Hello again, class. So I'm going to talk to you about arguably the most important, but certainly not the most widespread or most widely accepted social movement, and that is the abolitionist movement. And so these same sort of social currents and reformist, revivalist doctrines that were leading many evangelicals to really believe that slavery was the biggest evil and most terrible blight on the moral virtue of the U.S. And at first, this cause really attracted the least amount of attention from most reformers. Really, abolitionism was restricted to groups like the Quakers or free or enslaved black populations that were calling for their own emancipation. And there was a brief also abolitionist movement during the Revolutionary era, but the question had really faded from national life outside of occasional eruptions like the Missouri Compromise. And so before 1830, really most calls for abolition were restricted to either gradual emancipation, eventually abolishing slavery slowly over time with sort of different ideas about how that would go about, or conditional emancipation. And one of the primary conditional emancipation schemes was known as colonization, and that was the idea of sending formerly enslaved people and free black people to establish colonies outside of the United States, in Africa, in the Caribbean, and Central America. And in the United States, there was even societies founded for this cause. The American Colonization Society specifically was founded in 1816, and they actually did establish a colony in Africa in 1822 known as Monrovia. Who eventually established a formal country around this city called Liberia in 1845. And thousands of black people actually did immigrate there, some voluntary and some conditionally emancipated slaves. But really most black people in the United States were strongly against this, and it even motivated the very first National Assembly and all-black Congress, an all-black convention in the United States. And some all-black groups even removed the name African from their organizations just to eliminate any possible reason for deportation. In the South, you would often see Southerners trying to convince free blacks to leave the United States. Some believed that the presence of blacks were a danger to white society, or that slavery and racism were so embedded in the U.S. that blacks would never achieve equality. And so this, of course, colonization idea rested on the premise that America was for white people, much like Indian removal, or like we'll see next week with the U.S.-Mexico War and Mexican Americans. So by the 1830s, these social reform currents really had, the abolitionist movement specifically, had gradually become more progressive and active during this time. And they drew on the religious conviction that slavery was a sin, and also secular logic, sort of that slavery was inherently contradictory to the Declaration of Independence or Constitution. And so these calls for gradual or conditional emancipation evolved really into a demand for immediate emancipation. And these came from diverse groups, Baptists like William Lloyd Garrison, Congregationist revivalists like Arthur and Lewis Tappan and Theodore Weld, as well as radical Quakers like Lucretia Mott and John Greenleaf Whittier. These all helped to push to the center of reform agendas, abolitionism. And these relied on different tactics, but one of them was called moral suasion. And this was, abolitionists were mostly pacifists, and they believed that any type of coercion should be removed from human relationships and institutions. And so they believed that slaveholders needed to be convinced of their sinfulness of their ways, and that the North needed to be convinced of its complicity in the peculiar institution rather than direct resistance or by force or anything like that. And so they used explosive language for the time, insisting, that black people were real, valuable equals in American society. And of course, white abolitionists were certainly not racist. They instead, though, they did insist for equal participation, in economic and civil and political matters, regardless. And so, and one of the earliest calls that we see for this, or one of the earliest really strongest calls we see from this, came in 1829, and this came from a free black man named David Walker, and he was the son of an enslaved man and a free black woman. He had traveled widely in his life before settling in Boston, where he worked and owned clothing stores. and he involved himself in various reform causes. In 1829, though, he wrote a remarkable document called An Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World. In it, he exposed the hypocrisies of American claims for freedom and Christianity, and attacked the plan directly to colonize Black Americans in Africa. And he predicated that God's justice promised violence for the U.S. for enslaving Black people. And so he called upon Black people to mobilize, even by force if necessary. And he called on Blacks to take pride in the achievements of ancient African civilizations, and for them to claim direct rights as Americans. So this movement for immediate emancipation found a home in a publication called The Liberator, which was published by a man named William Lloyd Garrison in Boston. It started in 1831. Garrison himself had participated in reform causes in Massachusetts from a young age. In the 1820s, he advocated for Black colonization in Africa and the gradual abolition of slavery. Reading the works of Black Northerners like David Walker changed his mind, though, for the cause of immediate abolition. And so his writings in The Liberator were often reprinted by his haters in the South to condemn him. Famous abolitionists like the Grimke sisters would often publish in The Liberator, and of course this is facilitated by this this new printing technology, the steam printing press, and which is allowing this documents and other anti-slavery documents to be spread across the United States and elsewhere, as well as, like Ben talked about, this education movement expanding literacy in the United States. And so in 1833, he presided as reformers from 10 different states and founded a group called the American Anti-Slavery Society. And the American Anti-Slavery Society was just the first of, or one of many anti-slavery groups, and it was founded in 1833. By 1840, there was 100,000 Northerners in different anti-slavery groups and these worked with Black activists to establish schools, churches, voluntary organizations. And of course, new technology is also important here, because these anti-slavery literature is being circulated on new transportation that's allowing it to spread across the United States faster than ever. They're sending letter campaigns to the United States, spamming the House of Representatives, and preachers and orators, of course, are also important here. One man, Theodore Weld, he himself was a very gifted orator who trained other speakers in the North. And they penetrated small and rural towns with the same methods of revivalist preachers, honestly: fervent preaching, lengthy messages, calls for individuals to renounce their ways. And so just using the very simple message that slavery was a sin, and it was essential, this logic that slavery was a sin, for replacing these older calls for gradual and conditional emancipation with immediate. And so anti-slavery advocates also pioneered different fundraising methods. One of them is known as bazaars, where women would sell clothing and embroidery made by sewing groups, or also very expensive goods, silks, porcelain, jewelry, works of art from the British Isles. One in particular, the National Anti-Slavery Bazaar in Boston, was making thousands of dollars per year by 1850, and there was also lots of these, though, all across the United States. And